So my name's Anne Blake. I work at the UK Office for National Statistics and I'm Head of Population and Migration Statistics Transformation. We've been working for several years now on how we can develop admin-based population estimates, and in this presentation I'll provide some insights into our journey so far that perhaps may be helpful to you. There are a few places in my presentation where I've used acronyms on the slides, but I've tried to do is in the notes underneath just indicate what those acronyms stand for and what that means. So hopefully if you're able to share the presentation around Gloria, people will be able to see that. Let's try and make this work. Yeah, so just getting started on our journey was quite daunting given how much we had to achieve, but our starting point has always been the population statistics that our users need. And the diagram on the right, although it's not something that we developed very early on, it's a relatively recent diagram, sort of aims to show that our user needs are at the heart of what we do, and in that context it's really important to understand what we need to measure when we refer to population estimates. For us the UN definition is key, but the data sources we have, admin data sources that is, don't neatly fit into that definition. So we need to develop the methods to help us more closely do that and ensure that we can continue to produce the outputs that our users need. In getting started on our journey, we had a sort of first attempt to produce some population estimates. We'd got hold of a variety of admin sources, some of which we already had in the office, and we'd spent quite a lot of time trying to understand those individual sources and understand how they related to the population individually. Also trying to work out how we could link data sets together, the variables that we could use to do that. And then we kind of really needed to just get started to develop some different sets of rules to decide who to include. So we created 12 different statistical population data sets, or SPDs, using 2011 data, and sort of settled on our preferred first attempt, a combination really of how well the rules seem to perform when the results are compared to the 2011 census and how easy it was to explain to other people what we'd done. And we published those results with the aim of gathering feedback from users about what they thought about that approach. Oh, let's just go back. So our first attempt, we were using data from the patient register, so a list of people registered with doctors in the UK, and information from the Department of Work and Pensions on a list of people who had ever interacted with the tax and benefit system, so obviously including some people who had left the country as well. So to try and filter out some of those people, we included records that appeared on both sources. We included all children aged 0 to 4 who were on the patient register only, because fewer of them would have been on our CIS, Customer Information System. And our higher education records were included if they were also present on either our patient register or our tax and benefits data. There were some exclusions where we were able to identify that people had died, where we were able to identify that somebody had a out of Great Britain or UK country code, or somebody had been marked on our patient register for removal. That's known as an FP69. And then because we had some people where their addresses were different between between the different sources of information, we decided to try and allocate them half and half to both areas rather than choose a specific address, which did make it quite complex, and that's not one of the rules that we've carried through to our later attempts, which I'll talk about a bit later. So that was really us just having a go, trying to get going, and we knew that it was a long way from where we needed to reach, but getting started and sharing that progress with the users gave us some really helpful feedback. Does anybody want to come in with any questions at that point, or shall I carry on?
I just have a question on when you talk about users, you mean formal ministries of government, or who are the users? Is it
so our kind of primary users will include other government departments, but also there's a lot of use made of our population data by local authorities. So that's our kind of local government structure in the UK. And actually those local authorities can be some of the most vocal and challenging users if in those areas where perhaps their estimates of what's happening with the population don't necessarily align so well with those that ONS produces. But when I refer to users, I generally mean everybody that's using our data, but then there will be some that we talk to much more frequently than others, and those are the ones that are making the biggest use and, you know, potentially the biggest decisions using our information. The linkage that we've done. We don't have a national population register in the UK, so there's no single ID that's on all our data sources that we could use to link things together. So I'm just going to talk through a little bit about the linkage challenges that we've encountered and sort of how that might kind of relate to you. So it's very much about understanding the linkage problem for your data. And that I think will vary from country to country. So matching scale, how big are the data sets you need to match? For us in the UK, we were matching, well, 2 of our data sets had over 70 million records on. So that's a huge, huge exercise, but and potentially has sort of implications for how much matching you want to do automatically beyond when you're matching maybe smaller data sets. Then really important for us, the matching variables. If we don't, as I said, have a common reference ID across all our data sets, so we had to think really hard about what variables we did have that we could use and what the limitations of those might be. And in a moment on the next slide, I'll just kind of show how we combined things to sort of improve the linkage we could achieve. So having identified those variables, we put them together in combinations and looked at how unique those combinations were on particular data sets, on a particular data set, to try and understand whether we had a fairly unique kind of set of matching data, because the less unique it is, the kind of more occasions where you'll get multiple matches, and it'll be difficult to determine which matches are real and which ones aren't. And also thinking about linking individual sources longitudinally over time, which I know in the UK we can do using a unique ID on our patient register and also on our tax and benefits data, and that can be quite powerful as well in terms of what it can tell you. So just looking at the variables that we used. For us in the UK, postcode is a really important area identifier, and that is used in our addressing system. So that was kind of our area identifier. We then had forename, surname, date of birth and sex, and then different combinations of sort of elements of those things. So our first name, that was kind of our first match key, and then as we go on to the second one, we take the first name initial and the surname initial. So we kind of relax the matching rules around name and use postcode district, which is a kind of slightly bigger area than our unit level postcodes. We then sort of tighten up the name a bit further by using the first two letters of the forename and surname, but relax the condition for the area. So we use the postcode area, which is an even bigger area than a postcode district. And then we start to get down into sort of match keys, which are even further relaxed. All the way through to number 10, where we then swap the forename and the surname round in case they have been swapped on one of the sources that we're trying to match, or we take a middle name and a surname and try and then match that against the forename and surname where somebody may have used their forename on one source and their middle name on another. It's very much a kind of finding the variables that work on the data sources that you have, finding variables that are common across those data sources, and thinking about how unique they are, and the kind of the quality of the data, how it's been captured, and kind of all of those sorts of things. So I'll just kind of pause there and check if there are any questions at that point around the linkage.
I have a question, and
yeah,
I just wanted to find out, is the postcode at household level, or is it something that is unique and can be linked to every individual?
No, the postcode is it's used by the Royal Mail for delivering post, and it's kind of at a street level approximately, but then for some bigger streets you might get postcodes that more than one postcode covering a whole street. For some smaller streets you might get a postcode might cover more than one, so it's not a very kind of specific area, and is primarily.
And so it might be something like 30 to 40 households, something like that. It's that sort of number, isn't it, Anne?
Yeah, it is that sort of number, but I think I was just going to say in that it's primarily designed for delivering mail, so not necessarily perfect for helping identify addresses. Okay, I'll carry on. So making progress. Since our first attempt at producing an SPD, we've made quite a bit of further progress. We've developed our rules further and included new data sets. And one of the that was on our kind of version 2 attempts. Then with our version 3 attempt, we moved to using activity or signs of life in the data rather than presence. So that's somebody who we could see had changed their address on the patient register, so we knew that they were still here, or they'd interacted with a tax or benefit system, so they'd either paid tax or received some benefits. With the school census, it was kind of evidence of that those children were in education, and similarly with our sort of higher education data set. So it's very much about trying to tackle any overcoverage that might be there in our registers. We also developed quality targets, which then helped us when we were comparing with the 2011 census results and helping us assess against those quality targets. And again, we published our results to try and get that feedback that we needed from users. So this is a map that shows all the local authorities in England and Wales, and compares our second attempt at a statistical population data set to the 2011 census results. So you can see that most of the areas on the map are grey, and that means they're within our 3.8% target of the 2011 census. And there are a few areas, notably in London and sort of one or two others, where they're either they're further away than that 3.8%. That 3.8% target came from the quality that we have in our population estimate system at the moment, but I kind of won't say too much about that because it's quite complicated, how we came to that number. But suffice to say, I think it's important to have an idea of the kind of quality that you're aiming for. But having looked at the map, the grey areas would suggest that we were doing quite well. But actually, we also looked at the age-sex breakdown of the estimates at a national level, and what you can see in the chart on the right-hand side is that for men of working age, so between 30 and 59, those estimates were always higher than the census, or for those groups, those estimates were higher than the census. But for women and children and older people, their estimates were lower. So those grey areas were hiding lots of under and over coverage when you started to look at the demographic makeup of the population. And that's one of the things that kind of prompted us to move on and do our version 3. Having completed our version 3, and somewhat unhelpfully for you, we changed the name from statistical population data set to admin-based population estimate at that point in time. So if anyone's confused by the acronyms, that's why it's changed. So having produced our version 3, we then actually linked at an individual level back to the 2011 census to try to see what we could learn about the people we knew we had in our ABPE and the people that we didn't. So we linked 47 million records. There were then a further 7.2 million on our ABPE that we didn't find in the census, and 6.5 million on the census that we didn't find in the ABPE. Now we know that for some of those, a proportion of those, they will be missed links where our linkage variables just didn't pick up those links. And we also know that there will be some people that we found in the ABPE who didn't respond to the 2011 census. And likewise, people who responded to the 2011 census, but we didn't have on the ABPE. But as a part of our producing our ABPE, we do have something that we call the spine, which is a list of everybody that we can identify as ever having been present in the UK from the data sources that we've got. And then our rules kind of filter those out that we think are no longer in the UK. And we found that many of those records still linked to 2011 census respondents. And because we had the 2011 census, we were able to look at the characteristics of those people and try to understand a little bit more about them. And one of the really important features for us was that many of them were self-employed, and we knew that we didn't have any admin data to help us identify people that were self-employed and who didn't have any signs of activity on the other data sets. So a real important area for us now is to well, we have got access to some data from our tax system about people who are paying self-assessment contributions, which indicates that they're self-employed. So we're at the very early stages of trying to understand that data and work out how we can bring that into our analysis to try and help tackle that issue. Alongside that, we can also we also know that we've still got some overcoverage in the ABP. So there were a number of people that we had linked to the 2011 census, but had in the 2011 census they were short-term migrants or visitors. So our admin data is kind of suggesting that we think they're here long-term in the UK, but the census indicated that they were here short-term. So we've got some challenges there also to try to resolve. So that analysis has kind of really taught us a lot about how to further refine our rules, and I think the message I'm trying to give here is that each stage you work through and each new data source you bring in, each new set of rules you try, you learn something new that you can then build upon. And again, I'll just pause there and see if there are any questions.
And I think in the interest of time, I'll just carry on. People can ask questions in chat.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll keep going then. I've just got a little bit to cover around understanding quality, where we have been developing a quality framework, and there's a lot to think about, and this framework helps us understand all the different areas of quality that are important in using admin data to produce population estimates. But across the middle there, I think the three arrows, I don't know whether you can see where I'm pointing: input quality, process quality, and output quality. I'll just say a little bit more about that. So on input quality, that's really about evaluating individual data sources, looking at coverage, timeliness, how the collection process might influence the data. The process quality, I've focused on the kind of linkage process in terms of what proportion of records have you linked, the linkage rates, and then thinking about false positives and false negatives, and how you can estimate those and sort of understand how that influences what you're doing. And finally, output quality, so the quality of the population estimates. So all our analysis that we've done so far, we've compared to the 2011 census, but we know that also contains error. And if we move to a situation where admin data becomes a replacement for the census, we can no longer benchmark against the census to tell us about quality. So we need to develop an independent measure, and that's kind of the key thing that we're trying to do now. So to kind of summarize, I think what I would say is throughout what you're doing, keep talking to the to the people that are using the information you provide, and keep talking to the people that supply the data that you're using to the admin data that you're using to develop. Try to get access to some admin data and make a start. It may not be necessary to worry that you don't have access to everything that you'd like, but have a go, make a start, understand what each source tells you on its own, and find out what you can learn from linking two sources together, and then sort of move beyond that. Try different approaches, keep learning. You won't get it right first time. We know we didn't. We know we've still got a long way to go. Be prepared for the admin data to change as data suppliers bring in new systems or new rules or new administrations. Sometimes that can influence the data, and it's really important to know when that's happened and understand how that feeds through into your work, and share what you learn with your users and with other countries, and listen to the feedback that you get, and try to think about how you can act on that. So that's the end of my presentation. We've published several reports to date, and I've included a link to our latest update. I thought I'd put my contact details on this slide, but Gloria has got my email address and hopefully my phone number too, so maybe you could share that with the group, Gloria, if people would like to get in touch with me and ask any further questions.
Absolutely, and we will include the contact details on those slides when we post them on the website. And yeah, I think I can also post them on the chat box. But thank you so much for that great presentation. And I want to welcome comments from the floor or any questions. And while I do, I just have a small one about, so what you will be running, when will you be running your next census? And
so we will be running our next census in 2021. So it's March 2021. So we are well into the preparations for that now, and that will give us a really good opportunity to use to do some comparisons between 2021 admin data and the census, and see how much progress we've made.
Thank you.
And really, really interesting presentation. Thank you very much. Just one question, which I'll probably ask Christine later on as well. The UN guidance on censuses says that as a precondition, if you're going to move to a registered-based or administrative-based census, the country needs to have a national ID system with a unique identifiers. Now, of course, the UK and New Zealand and actually Germany don't have those. Would you say that that precondition still applies, or do you think that the work that you're doing suggests that actually you can make progress even without a unique ID?
I think that the work that we've done has shown that you can make a lot of progress without a unique ID. And bearing in mind in the UK, we've also had the challenge of needing to work with all the identifying information on data sets having been hashed or encrypted. So it's very difficult to do some of the matching that we need to do. To make the amount of progress that we've done has been, I think, has been a sign of success. But I think that there's still a long way for us to go, and we're breaking down the barriers to access to data in the clear. And as we're able to use that and kind of have greater kind of level of matching quality, I think we'll understand more about just how close we can get.
Super.
All right. Colleagues, any questions or comments? All right. And I think we will let you go off and take a rest.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us at this late hour of the night. We really appreciate your contribution to our series. So
Okay,
thank you. We'll just move on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you. We will hear from Stats New Zealand now.
I'll get started. The journey that Anne's described with the ONS is quite close in a lot of ways, really, with Stats New Zealand, and we've been talking to the ONS over the for probably the last 10 years, really, about these kinds of things. But today I'm going to talk more about how we've used administrative data in the 2018 census. So there's many ways to use administrative data in a census. Admin-based census actually is often more often referred to as a register-based census, but we tend to shy away from those words a little bit in New Zealand. So we have been looking to the long-term future of our census in New Zealand through a census transformation program. We started this in about 2013 and looking to see whether we can use administrative data to replace the full field enumeration census. So we've done quite a lot of work with that, which I'll show you a bit more about soon. But within the traditional census, there's lots of ways to use administrative data as well. And so some of the examples are supporting a field operation through creating a dwelling frame from administrative address sources. Predicting the occupancy status of dwellings is something that some countries are progressing now. You can use administrative sources to replace some questions in the census. So for example, Canada has no longer asks a question about income. They obtain their income information from tax. You can fill in missing responses from your census questionnaires or use administrative data for editing responses. You can sometimes have new variables from administrative data, for example, if they might be quite hard to ask on a questionnaire. And in New Zealand, we've been looking at age of dwelling as an example of that. And you can include people who are missed by field collection in the census, which has not been done much. Oh, sorry. So we planned some of this use of administrative data in the 2018 census in New Zealand. So we developed a dwelling frame to support the field operation. The dwelling frame was created from administrative address sources, and we used that for about 80% of the country to mail out census forms so that people could respond online. We had planned to use administrative data in the processing system where there was item non-response, so where people had missed answering some of the questionnaire, so some variables we had thought we would fill in with administrative data. And quality assessment is another example. So sometimes you'll have administrative data which is quite close to what you expect your census results to be, and you can do a comparison to see how good your census is. However, the census was held in March in 2018, and by April it was fairly clear that our overall response rate was too low. We weren't quite sure at the time what it was going to be, but it was clear that particularly in areas where there were high concentrations of Maori and Pacific people, they had much lower response rates than other areas, but it was also low right across the country. So we needed to do something about this, and because we had been looking at administrative data for quite a while, and we produced a resident population, as Anne has described in the ONS, we'd come quite a long way with that. And so we decided that we would try to use administrative records to to include people who did not respond to the field collection. So we called those records admin enumerations. So it's an adjustment for unit non-response, so for people who didn't respond to the field collection. And in the census, we always try to put most people into the dwellings where they live, and so we tried to do that as far as we could with the administrative data we had to create households, but in some cases we couldn't reliably create households, so we placed people in the small area where they live. And we used administrative data for variable information much more than we'd planned, because with those admin enumerations, that was the only source of information we had. So we had some advantages. We had to develop this for the 2018 census very quickly, but we had a pretty good starting point. So we had developed a statistical location register for the mail out of the 2018 census. So that gave us a national list of addresses and address IDs, and we were linking address information from administrative sources to those address IDs. We had an extensive person level linked data, which I'll show you in a minute, through our integrated data infrastructure, the IDI. And we had gained quite a lot of experience with linking that data sources together. So in New Zealand, as with the UK, there is no national person ID, and in fact our Privacy Act prohibits the creation of a national ID. So we have linked our data slightly differently from the ONS using a statistical process called probabilistic linking, but all of the kinds of things that Anne was talking about apply for that as well. But we had done that. And we'd undertaken quite a lot of research in terms of thinking about a long-term census based on administrative data. So we did have quite a good estimate of the resident population that we'd obtained from administrative data. And we had quite a good understanding of what administrative data we could use for many variables. And we had already, as part of our census processing system, we were linking the census responses into the IDI already. So that was where we were at in sort of April 2018, and needing to extend that methodology and develop in ways that would allow us to add people back into the census file. So this is what the IDI looks like. So there's a central spine, which so the New Zealand population is around 5 million people now. The spine includes people who've ever been present in New Zealand or lived in New Zealand really, and there's about 10 million people in that spine. And to that spine we have linked a lot of government data sources. We're very lucky to have border movements data, so that when people travel in and out of New Zealand, that's recorded and we match that to the spine. We've matched education data, justice and police data, benefits data, health data, tax data, very important, and a number of Stats New Zealand surveys, as well as the 2013 census. And that IDI has grown really quite rapidly over the last 5 years or so. The spine itself, if you had a national population register and ID, that would be your spine, but we do not have that. And so we have created that from 3 data sources. We've linked our New Zealand birth registrations from 1920. We've linked visa applications into New Zealand to pick up people who've come from overseas to live in New Zealand, but these are only available from 1997. And we've also used tax registration, so everyone who's got a tax number is also in the spine. So those are linked and deduplicated so that we're finding unique individuals amongst those 3 data sources. And so that's what all the linked data looks like. And we use that as the basis for selecting a New Zealand resident population at a given time. So we start with all the people in the spine, And then we have quite a lot of activity data available. So we look to see individuals who, for example, have paid tax, have received benefits, have been to the doctor or have been in hospital, have enrolled in education. And people who've done that within the previous 2 years, we say, okay, that looks like they've been living in New Zealand. We then take out people who have died before the reference date, and we take out people who have migrated overseas before the reference date. And we can do that because deaths are linked into the spine and the migration data is linked in there as well. So we created an admin New Zealand resident population. We had quite a lot more access to administrative data than the ONS had when they started, so we benefited a lot from the IDI, which was actually developed for research purposes. And then, so for the 2018 census, we had 2 sets of information about the population. So we had the census responses in the green there. So we have a list of all the people who returned individual forms, and we also had some people who were only listed on a household form and didn't give us an individual form. And for the people that filled out forms, we had most of the information for the variables that are asked for on the census form. However, that was incomplete by quite a long way, really. And on the other side in the blue, we had our administrative resident population. So, in fact, a more complete list of people. We have an age and the sex and a location where they live for nearly all of them, and we have some other variables about those people that we've been able to bring together from the administrative data sources in the IDI. And so we combined those 2 data sources through linking the census responses to the admin population. And again, this is a probabilistic link. And we have measured the accuracy of that linkage, which it's very high, although there is still some error in it. And from that group of people in the admin population who we don't have a census response for, we selected some of those people to add to the census file to count the people who are missed. So this final 2018 census data set looks like this. So we have people counted because they responded to the census field collection, and we've got people counted because we've included them from administrative records. And the information about variables for people who filled out the census form, most of it comes from the census form, but we've been able to fill in some gaps for item non-response, as we'd planned to do from administrative data. And for the administrative records and the household listing, the only information we have for the variables is from the administrative data, and also the previous census in 2013 is a valuable source of information for some variables. I think I might just stop there if there's any questions about how we did that. Well,
I was going to ask a quick question, Christine. I think I know the answer to this question, but I think it might be useful for other people. So what was the percentage of census records versus admin records in the 2018 census? What was the mix?
Oh, I think that's my next slide. I should have gone to this. So, yeah, no, thank you, Ian. So overall, the 89% of the census file is made up of census responses and 11% from administrative data. That's not the final measure. We will be releasing in a week or two the coverage measurement that we undertake with our coverage survey. So there's a little bit of undercoverage in that data, but the data source, the census data set is 89% responses and admin data. But if you look at the ethnic groupings of that response versus admin data, you can see very marked differences. So the European and Asian have got 90% from census responses, but Maori and Pacific only just over 3/4 of those groups we have from census responses, and a full quarter of their information comes from administrative data. So it indicates quite a big failing in our census field work, but it also shows the benefits of being able to have administrative data to fill those gaps. Okay. So that's the sort of broad outline of what we did. So I'm just going to talk a bit more about the sort of hows and kind of what happened. Some things that were really important. So you have to have linked data, and having a high quality of the linking is important. So the linking in that IDI is it's large-scale linking. It's basically industrial scale linking, and it's all automated, and we measure the quality of that. And we just had to work with what was there. A really critical linking for this exercise was the linking of this 2018 census to the IDI, and we worked really hard to get high linkage rates and low false linkage rates on that, and we made some adjustments in our methods to allow for missed links. So, but if you're going to use admin data sources, understanding those admin data sources is, you have to start there, and we used quality frameworks to assess the quality of the sources, and I'll come back to that a little bit in a minute. And as Anne was saying as well, you need to be really clear about what your purpose is and what quality you need for that. There's lots of different ways to use administrative data for statistical purposes, and you need to understand what you need for the particular thing that you're doing. There are always trade-offs being made, and you need to make judgments about what you'll use and when. I'll come back to that a little bit as well. We were in a very challenging situation after the 2018 census field collection, and we put together an external data quality panel that Anne was part of. So we gained an enormous amount from the discussion and challenge we got from bringing our ideas to that group as we were developing them. And that feedback helped us a lot. We also, before we released the census data, we brought in some of our key users to look at the results and to test them against what they were going to be using the information for. So that was another important part of our quality assurance. Communications, you just can't underestimate the importance of telling people what you're doing. I don't think we could have done better at the early stages of this, shall I say, but we've worked really hard to try to explain to our users what we've done with the census 2018 data set. It's a whole lot different from what they've had before, and they weren't given advance notice because we didn't know we were going to do this. And we've tried really hard to describe the quality of the new 2018 census data. There's a lot of things to say, so I think we've done quite a lot. We could probably do more or better. But the main thing probably is to say that this is not a good idea to try to rescue your census at such a late stage. It's much better to plan and design in advance how you're going to use administrative data. And as we've talked about what happened with the 2018 census in New Zealand with other countries, a lot of people have been very interested, but they've also, most countries that we talk with have started to develop their contingency planning for their next census and thinking about how they might use administrative data if things don't go as planned, even though they may not use the admin data if in their sort of a normal situation. So Anne talked a lot about the admin population. I'm going to talk just a little bit more about the variables and where we got administrative data for them. So the group of the set of data in blue there is the data that's linked in the IDI that we've used in some way for census variables. I'm not going to go through that in any detail, but I think probably the main message is that it's complicated. Often there are several sources of information for a single variable, and quite a few data sources are used for a number of different variables. The link of the address ID back to the statistical location register is really important, and we have a business register that gives us information about industry and workplaces for those variables. And the variables along the bottom in grey, they are variables which we don't have administrative data for, so those are the ones that have been most affected by the non-response in the census. And they show the importance of having a good collection, questionnaire collection. So in terms of understanding the data sources, this slide is really more about the prospective quality that is in Anne's slide. So when we started, we did not know much about the data sources, and we didn't know, what they would be good for. And so there's some key, pretty basic questions that you need to understand before you get too far along in using a data set. And sometimes this information will come from stuff that's been published on a website, or maybe you can obtain documentation from an agency, or often you just need to go and talk to them. So basic questions like, what's the purpose of this data collection? What things are most important to the agency? How is the data collected? What are the administrative reporting units? We might want information about people. They might record information about events, so a tax payment. So can you get to an individual from the reporting units? What individuals are included in that admin population? Which variables are available? Is there geographic information? How long has it been available for? How often is it updated? And a pretty basic one is, can you actually access the data? Is it legal? Can you do it practically? Is there a cost? So those are the kind of questions that we started with. And then we've done more detailed analysis on quite a few variables now, the ones that looked like they had good potential from an early look at the metadata. And those are the variables that are in blue on this diagram, dark blue, and we've done detailed analysis for. And this diagram is using a quality framework that's built off a total survey error framework. So on the vertical axis we have coverage, so that's how much of your population do you have information about. And on the x-axis is measurement error, so how close to the statistical concept that you want to know about is the information in the administrative data. And perhaps the key message from this is that there's just a huge variation from, on the bottom left-hand side to almost nothing useful available from administrative data, to variables on the top right like birthplace or industry, where the administrative data's got excellent coverage and the measurement is really close to where you want it. So you might have a picture like that, and then you need to think about your statistical purpose. And in the 2018 census, we didn't need administrative data for everybody. We wanted to fill in gaps for the information for people that we didn't have the information for. And so we were looking for variables where the concept was fairly close to what we wanted to measure in the census. And the variables in the red circles are the ones that we have actually used and brought through to the 2018 census file.
Christine, can I just ask a question?
Yes.
So I think that this is something I know, but I think that from memory, there were some variables from admin data that were actually higher quality than you could collect in the census, I think you found.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's on the next slide, actually.
Okay, sorry, yeah.
Yeah.
Jumping ahead, sorry, I'm thinking ahead, sorry.
That's right.
So I think this kind of diagram is an excellent way of thinking about different dimensions of quality and how it fits to your purpose. I think that's a really important slide.
Yeah, And there's quite a lot done on these quality frameworks, and so it's well worth thinking about how to use them. Some of these variables which were good don't have red circles because we hadn't done the work at the time. So another lesson is that you can't just sort of jump in and do this really fast. You need to spend the time to understand your data source. And so as I said before, there's always trade-offs, and sometimes, you know, there's an advantage in using the administrative data. So an example is people don't always answer their income question on the census all that accurately. Or it's not too bad really, but we could expect that the taxable income for salary and wages and the would be better, and particularly it's very obvious that people don't answer very well about what their benefit income is, and the administrative data is better for that. Sometimes the administrative data does have major coverage gaps, but we still use that information, but alongside imputation as well. So for example, we have a variable about household tenure, whether you rent a house, the house that you live in, or whether you own it, or whether it's in a family trust. And we do have information about some of the rental population, but not about all of the people who rent, and none about the ownership. So we used the rental information that we had, but we needed to impute the missing data for the other people, otherwise the information would have been quite skewed. Sometimes there is some measurement error in the administrative data. It's not quite what you want. An example there is ethnicity. People provide ethnicity, you know, at the doctors or education. It may not be quite what they would have responded in the census. But it was still far better for us to use that ethnic information that people had supplied themselves than to try and impute a value for them or to leave that information missing. One of the things we did was to treat the previous census as an administrative source. So that's really great for variables that don't change much over time, so like country of birth. We also used the smoking status of a person 5 years ago and came in for some criticism for that because it doesn't pick up people who may have changed over the last 5 years. So it's not clear whether you would get a better result doing it another way, but we will have a look at that. And time lags are another thing. Sometimes administrative data is just slower than survey responses. When we were processing the admin data for the 2018 census, we had data that was up to 5 months after census day. And so for most data sources, we had information that covered the period that we wanted. But we did have a problem with school enrolments. They're quite late to come into the IDI, and we did not have enrolment information for the census month, which limited our ability to use that enrolment data for student participation. And so just to summary again, this is the point that Anne made. We learnt a huge amount in the 2018 census using these new sources in practice. There are things you have to deal with that you don't realise in an abstract sort of or research kind of situation. We didn't always get it right, but it was really important to make a start. The administrative records that we've used in the 2018 census achieved a much better bias reduction than we could have got with the imputation methods that we'd used before. The admin data does pick up people who don't typically respond to the census. Maybe not everybody, but certainly some of them. So in the next census, New Zealand is in 2023. We do want to get high response rates. We do not want to be left with a large amount of people not responding. But we will use administrative sources to fill gaps in responses, and where possible, and we will do that by designing that in from the beginning. Learning from what we did in 2018 with some improvement, but basically the same idea. And I think I mentioned before that there's been lots of international recognition of the importance of having contingency plans and thinking about how you're going to use administrative data beforehand. And just to finish, no data source is perfect. Census responses are not perfect. Administrative data is not perfect. But if you understand the quality of what you've got, then people can use it if you tell them. So I think that's where I was going to stop. I have some references, and I forgot also to put my contact details on the slides.
Christine, we can include them on the slides that we post on the website finally.
Thank you.
And thank you for an excellent presentation. Colleagues, do we have questions for New Zealand?
I might just, go on, so whoever that was, go ahead.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Christine. I just had a question in relation to the spine and how that was, created. And were there any, this came through in the slides, but were there any pieces of the spine that were more important in the development of the IDI and in relation to how it was used for the census?
Not really. You need all of it. When we started with the IDI, well, before we started the IDI, really, we used tax registrations as the main the linking, the population that we would link other things to, and they give quite coverage of the adult population, but not for children. There's no compulsory requirement to have a tax number in New Zealand. So once we were interested in linking data about children, we needed to think a bit harder about getting a full population. And the birth visas and tax combination does seem to work pretty well. We think there's a little bit of undercoverage. So for example, Australians and some Pacific Island groups do not need a visa to come to New Zealand, and they won't be on the spine until they get a tax number. But like Anne's diagram, we've linked the census to the IDI and looked at, what's in one and not in the other, and it looks like there's very low numbers missing from the spine. There is a little bit of duplication on the spine from missed linkages in that group that we've tried to remove. But no, they're all important. We couldn't manage without any one of them, of those three data sources, but also if you start trying to add new data sources into the spine, you end up having to worry more about record linkage errors. So if you miss links, you're creating two records for the same person. So we feel like it's quite a sweet spot now. Although,
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thanks, Christine. I also have a question about the social licensing issue and communication. So generally what we've been hearing from this series is that we should not be thinking that it's automatic for the public to accept use of their registered data for statistical purposes. So what does that social licensing look like for you? What does it entail?
A lack of engagement on our part, I think would be fair to say. So for the IDI itself, that's been around for a little while, and it's been used a lot for research, and that the research is, we don't really get any criticism of the use of having the linked data there for research. But because we hadn't planned this use of administrative data in the 2018 census, we didn't have a conversation about, social license and whether people thought it would be good or not. What we did do was develop a privacy impact assessment, which went through the principles that we have in our Privacy Act about when you should use information and things like that. And we also have our really robust processes around privacy, security and confidentiality that we apply to all of our statistical outputs. But I think it would be fair to say that we have not had the wider conversation with the public that we should have had and that we will need to have before the 2023 census. It's also true that from the public we've had very little. I don't know if we've had any actual criticism from general public. There has been criticism from Maori stakeholders and questions from the External Data Quality Panel about whether we had the social licence or not.
Thank you.
As again, if when you're doing it by design, you would plan that in.
And I think, Christine, that you're planning, well, you're already doing, I think, that engagement with the Maori community in a prospective way for the next census, aren't you?
That's right. Yeah.
So I've just got one comment and then one question. So the External Data Quality Assurance Panel that I was on, I would say that we acted, or we tried to act, we hoped we acted anyway as critical friends. And I think that kind of model for other countries that are going down this route is quite a good one. People that you can bring inside the tent and share details with that you can't do more generally, but give you an external perspective. Was that your, I hope that was what you thought we were doing.
No, absolutely, yes, and with a range of different expertise. You know, so we had some academics who use the census data a lot. We had Thomas Lumley, a statistical methodologist, highly eminent statistician. You know, we had Ian, an outside person with, you know, long experience in censuses. We had Maori representatives, and ex-government staff. So a range of people who bring a different perspective. I don't think they always agreed with each other, which is good.
No,
and they provided us with really useful feedback and challenges at times, which, you know, we took note of.
So we didn't always agree.
No, who would?
One question. I might invite Tracy to chip in because I know she's made this point before. You talked about contingency planning and the use of admin data for contingency plan. I mean, potentially with COVID, etc., that might be more important for countries that are about to do their censuses than it has been in the past. Is that what you think?
Yes. So New Zealand belongs to, with a group of countries, to what we call the International Census Forum. So that's basically England, UK and English-speaking countries like Canada, United States, Australia, New Zealand. And we meet sort of annually, really, to discuss how censuses in our countries, and like the United States are in the middle of trying to deal with census in the middle of a pandemic. In fact, they had made earlier plans for using administrative data, although they didn't plan on a pandemic being part of the mix. But we've been meeting regularly with that group of countries, and they're all developing contingency plans and all trying to think through what administrative data have we got, how might we use it, do we want to use it as a normal part of our operation, or do we only want to bring it in if we get to a certain point and we're having difficulties. But it's become, I think, the COVID they were already serious, you know, a year ago about contingency and admin data, because you never know what's going to happen in a census. But COVID has only reinforced that even more.
Well, thank you very much, Christine. And I think there are quite a lot of questions that we might not be able to exhaust through this call. And we still have a platform, I'm sure, to engage with you on email and following up to your presentation. So
Absolutely.
I'm just a bit conscious of time, which means it will be nice for us to move on to our last presenter. But we'd like to really thank you very much for sharing New Zealand's experience. It's really great learning from you and from your experience.
Thank you. I'm more than happy to follow up with questions and so on.
Thank you. So Ian, you have your slot now.
Yeah, super. So we've heard in previous webinars about countries that are doing a fully registered-based census, and we've heard from the UK and New Zealand today about exploration of the use of admin data. What we haven't covered before is countries that do a combined census. They combine a census and a register. So I'm just going to briefly go through some examples from Germany, Spain and Italy. So starting with Germany. So Germany, there were lots of protests in 1983 to their census, and they didn't have a census in 2001, but they introduced a combined census model in 2011. So the combined census in Germany used administrative registers, so principally the population register and a register of employment information from the Federal Employment Agency. They developed an address register. This was created just for the combined census, a list of all addresses with a residential space. And this was used for the next two parts of the process. For buildings and dwellings, there was a complete census carried out. It was largely postal based to capture information on the addresses and the characteristics of the addresses. And then a 10% sample of households, and that was to collect variables that were not held in the registers. And then finally, for people that lived in communal establishments, so residential homes, army bases, etc., a full on-the-ground enumeration was carried out. Previous census tests had shown it was necessary to use the sample survey to correct for errors in the register for undercoverage and overcoverage, the kind of things that Anne and Christine have talked about. So the registers used were primarily the population register with information, demographic information and family relationships, so kind of who lived with whom. And that covered 86 million records. So Germany has a system of municipal population registers, kind of local population registers, and these were all collected together by the Statistikas Bundesamt, the NSO, the reference date, and combined into a national population register. And people that were registered at more than one address were identified and were corrected. And then most of the employment data used in their combined census came from the employment registers and also from registers for public service, so judges and public servants, etc. And these were also used to supplement some of the demographic information from other sources. So this diagram shows the main sources used in their combined model. The yellow boxes are from administrative sources, and the blue boxes, those in the middle anyway, are the direct data collection. So address data was taken from various sources and then combined to produce a statistical address register. And then there were data from the population registers and from the employment registers was used along with the full census of housing and the sample survey of households, the 10% sample, and then also the data collected for communal establishments. And these were all combined and analysed together to produce the census database from which estimates were produced. The challenges that Germany had, although they had a national ID scheme which has a ID identifier on, their federal court had ruled that it was unconstitutional to use that for statistical purposes. So the German Statistical Office, the NSO, wasn't able to use that unique ID. So they were, like the UK and like New Zealand, they were linking without a unique person ID. So they were linking in a very similar way that we've heard from the UK and New Zealand. They linked on information such as name, sex, date of birth, and then kind of address information, municipal code, street name, house number, etc. So there's a common message there. The 2011 combined census was regarded as a success, and it will form the basis for the 2021 census. Essentially a similar model, except that the employment data will come from the survey rather than from the employment register. And the analysis that the Germans did identified that the registers in themselves weren't of high enough quality to use without the survey to correct for under and over coverage. So that was Germany. I've just got a couple of slides on Spain. So Spain did a traditional census in 2001 with a full enumeration and with a very limited use of registers, and they used it for part of their quality assurance process. The 2011 census was a combined census, and this was seen as a stepping stone to a 2021 census. And there's a YouTube video on the Spanish 2011 census. It takes about 4 minutes. There's a link there for those that want to look at it later on. And then the 2021 census is planned to be a mostly register-based census, relying on the population registers, tax, social security, employment, qualifications, etc., and also using the previous census data. And it was interesting hearing from New Zealand that again they brought in their previous census data as an admin source. So I think one of the key features about the Spanish census is that the combined census was seen as a stepping stone between a traditional census and a fully registered-based census. So the key elements of the Spanish 2011 census, they pulled together data from administrative registers in advance. They also had a census of buildings to create an address register, and they captured characteristics of the buildings, number of rooms, number of bedrooms, that kind of thing. And they also geo-referenced all of the dwellings to basically create an address register that could be kept up to date, physical address register. They too had a sample survey. It was about 12%, and that captured information about variables that were not available from the registers themselves. It was available online, and for the census collectors that had to knock on people's doors, etc., they used tablets as well as we used for the building census. So the Statistics Office combined the registers and the sample. They modelled the survey results to represent the whole population, and that was used to provide all of the census information. And as in Germany, the survey was used to adjust for under and over coverage in the registers. And I think an important point is that the NSO spent a long time understanding, quality assuring and improving the national population database. And then finally, I'm moving on to talk about Italy. So Italy carried out what they called a registered assisted census in 2011. That was largely a traditional census, but they're planning for a combined census for 2021 and onwards. And this is a different model. They're having a rolling census every 5 years that mixes together registers and annual surveys. And as with Germany and Spain, the NSO has developed a statistical address register. And again, this includes geo-referencing of streets and dwellings and house numbers, etc. So I think there's a kind of key feature there about the importance of address registers that's come out in previous presentations. In Italy, they have local registers, municipal registers, that contain information on the people in the household and the address, and then events like births and marriages and deaths are recorded there, as well as when people move internally within the country or they move internationally. So the NSO in Italy took these approximately 8,000 local municipal registers, as well as previous census microdata, to produce a national statistical population register. And then other register sources that are being used, and these are the kind of typical ones that we've heard about before, the labour, employment, education, tax and benefits, people on with the permits to stay, sort of visa information, etc. So they're similar registers that we've heard about in other countries. What's also interesting and a bit different about Italy is that they're running two surveys. And so their so-called C-sample survey is designed to estimate and correct on an annual basis the population structure, so sex, age, marital status, etc., from the population that's included in the registers. And then a separate so-called D-sample survey between 600,000 to 900,000 households will collect the core information for variables that are not included in the registers. And this is an annual ongoing survey, so it enables this information and these outputs to be updated annually. And these surveys are run over a 5-year period covering the whole country, so 20% of the country each year. And they started in 2017 so that they could produce first set of census results for the 2020 round. So the last slide on Italy. The advantages that are seen of this approach for Italy is that it combines survey and register data. It spreads the workload and the cost evenly throughout the decade rather than having a big peak every 5 or 10 years. It will enable the population and other data to be updated every year. It obviously reduces the burden on respondents from using admin data and only a sample of people are having to respond every year. And then also, because it's a continuous fieldwork operation, that leads to efficiencies and gains in experience. So just last slide from me to summarise these approaches between Spain, Italy and Germany. So around statistical address registers, each of these countries created a statistical address register to support the census that didn't exist before. And in each of these countries, the main population estimates came from the population register, although these were adjusted by using information from the sample surveys. So in all of the countries, they recognised that you couldn't use the population registers themselves. There are often issues with over-coverage. So when people move within the country, they obviously re-register wherever they move to. When they leave the country, there's no incentive for them to deregister. So there are often people on the population register who've left the country and shouldn't be there anymore. And then the characteristics information in each of these countries and on the combined census model is coming from surveys of typically around 10 to 12%. So that was all I wanted to cover. It was a quick presentation on combined approaches. I'll just stop there in case there were any questions.
Oh, hi, Ian, Gloria. It's Tracy from StatsNZ here. Just wanted to jump in, and Christine, feel free to correct me, but when I was last involved in the Census Transformation Project, this type of model is what we were looking at for our longer term. So admin-based population counts or estimates supplemented with a coverage survey and a large-scale attribute survey to collect sort of the richness of the census data. And one other point I thought might be useful to emphasise was that along the path of our research, and I think the same was for ONS, we published results but made it quite clear that they were not official statistics. So for example, at Stats NZ, we had an experimental website. And so that's enabled us to publish that type of material with a bit more freedom than on our sort of official stats website. So that's another way of kind of getting the information out there, but making it quite clear that they're not official statistics during the development stage.
Yeah, the UK does something similar. They have what they call experimental statistics for the kind of under development. Those are typically things that are kind of more on their way to becoming official statistics, but aren't there yet. And they also, on the census, they published what they call just research outputs. But again, I agree with the point about putting stuff out there, but making it clear that it's kind of, it's not official statistics yet.
I think that's an excellent point because I had that in mind. Like, what do you do in the meantime to not to keep safe while you're doing your experimentation? So that's a great intervention.
I think there's real value, I mean, as both Anne and Christine were saying, there's real value in putting information out there because, users will look at the data in ways that you can never quite imagine or, in detail that you don't have the resources to do. So there's real value in doing that and, getting the feedback and learning where you've made mistakes or need to adjust, but equally doing it in a safe way that people don't start to use it inappropriately. So I think flagging up its status as experimental or research or something like that, I think is a good way of doing things.
Thank you, Ian. Do we have any other comments or questions?
Tracy, whilst you were speaking, was there anything you wanted to add around the New Zealand contingency? I see some comments in the chat that we didn't pick up on when we were under Christine's presentation.
Just to support really, and the examples, as you said, we've got COVID-19, but Samoa recently had to deal with a measles epidemic, which caused shutdowns and things. Obviously, unfortunately, there's cyclones that can impact the Pacific and New Zealand, earthquakes, etc. So in all of those scenarios, and whether it's for sample surveying or censuses, having that contingency is really useful. And I've just put an example up there following the earthquakes in New Zealand. We'd never had much joy getting access to mobile phone data from telecommunications companies, but that sort of crisis situation kind of encouraged them to share that, and that's possibly an opportunity that Pacific countries might have during COVID-19 as well, that extra demand for information and government support to get that can help. But from that we were able to look at the mobile phone polling of different mobile phone users in the lead up to the earthquake, and then afterwards to see whether people had been displaced, how many, and where they had moved to. So, we had people leaving Christchurch, for example, with their families and putting their children into school elsewhere while the schools here were closed. So it enabled the government to get a handle on that type of information. Following the crisis, we no longer had access to the data, but we've recently renegotiated that. So it was a good demonstration of how useful that can be.
When we talk about registers and admin data, we mostly refer to data that's held by government, but I think that's a good intervention in terms of actually the value of some private sector data, particularly mobile phone data.
Thanks.
We're just 5 minutes past the hour, so I think with that I would like to thank you again, colleagues, for joining this series, and thank you for joining us in our presentations today.